Hello, everybody, and welcome to another installment to the Red Shadow Remembers. And this time, I'm remembering not just a thing or an act, but rather an entire decade. Um, and that decade, of course, as you've seen in the title of the video, is the 90s. I'd have to go on record as saying the 90s is probably my favorite decade of my life. For both things that happened to me in my life, but also for the things that came from that decade. Of course, I do want to point out, and I think I've pointed this out before too, but obviously in the 2000s I was married and I had a child, and those were amazing. Having my child was an amazing thing, and for a while there the marriage thing was all right, but I don't want to let anybody get the impression that I think things like games and all that kind of stuff are more important than my kiddo. But we're kind of talking outside of those major life events. We're just talking about the things over the years that you come to grow and love, like games and movies and music and just stuff like that. Hopefully, that kind of clears it up a little bit. I'm not a total tool bag or anything. But I was born in the 70s, and I don't remember anything about the 70s. By the time the 70s were over, I was like 5. I was 5 to 15 during the 80s, and the 80s probably my second favorite decade in terms of things like I was just mentioning. The 80s, being that I was a kid, it was kind of carefree time, and I didn't really have responsibilities, so all I concerned myself with was things like getting through school and then going home so I could watch cartoons and play with my toys. And probably the longest lasting thing that I've taken away from the 80s was the music. The 80s were an amazing decade for music. Now the 90s were an amazing decade for music as well. It's one of the things that I miss about the 90s. I moved back into Montana, I believe it was in 1989, and I lived in a town called Missoula. And I think most people wouldn't know where Missoula is or anything really about Missoula. But in those days, the very, very early 90s, when the grunge scene was exploding over in Seattle, Missoula was actually kind of recognized, maybe it's unofficially, I mean this was just the way it was put to me by people I knew when I was still living there, but they were like, Missoula's considered like mini Seattle. And if anybody knows anything about grunge music and that scene, Seattle was the mecca. It was the capital of grunge music at that time. But we were known as being sort of like a mini version of Seattle, and part of that can go to back that up is that at least one or two of the guys from Pearl Jam went to the University of Montana, where I went to for 2 years. And for at least a few tours back in the 90s, they began their tours in Missoula with, the years I was living there and going to high school/college, I guess this was all after I started in college, but they started a tour one year in a small little auditorium type setting on the campus, probably just a couple hundred people there. But by the next year, the year after that, they'd exploded to such levels that they started a tour in Grizz Stadium, which was the football stadium that the University of Montana Grizzlies played football at. I didn't get to go to either show. I had to be honest, I really enjoy Pearl Jam's Vitalogy album, one of my favorite albums from the 90s, but I didn't listen to a lot of their other stuff. I was aware of the songs that they were known for before Vitalogy was out, but I just wasn't that into them. So there was no desire for me to go see the first show, and when the second show was happening, the only thing I had a desire to do was to maybe go up close to the campus and listen to the music, from outside of the stadium, which I didn't do. But the music of the 90s has always stuck with me. That was where I discovered the grunge groups that I really, really enjoyed. Pearl Jam's Vitalogy, but pretty much like the entire work back then of groups like Soundgarden, Stone Temple Pilots, Nirvana, of course, although I was kind of late to the party with Nirvana. The first time I heard a Nirvana song was when I was finishing up high school, and some guy was listening to it in this remedial English class that I had to take for some stupid reason. And I listened to a couple of songs because the teacher let him play the music as long as it wasn't super loud. And I just thought it was a lot of noise. I guess I was kind of a pop person at that point, and soft rock, 80s, a lot of my favorites from the 80s were just that, pop and rock and soft rock, but no hair bands and nothing like that. I wasn't into anything that was harder music. So, like I said, I was late to the party with Nirvana, but I did end up getting into them. And I'm trying to think of some other groups, but I guess it jumps ahead a few years to mid to late 90s when I got into, well, I was into rap music for a long time, which I think a lot of people would be surprised by that, but I was really big into sort of the lightweight stuff in the late 80s and early 90s, like your MC Hammers, Vanilla Ice, DJ Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince, and a lot of other things in there. Third Bass was somebody that I got into. But then like mid to late 90s, I started to get into stuff that was maybe a little more gritty for a guy like me of this particular persuasion. But I got into like Snoop Dogg and Dr. Dre and Public Enemy. I actually liked Public Enemy earlier in the 90s, even though I didn't really get into all the political aspects of their music. But after a while, I kind of got through what I considered to be a phase, and maybe it was just because I was starting to not like the stuff that was coming out later on, like, P. Diddy, Puff Daddy, whatever he's calling himself, and some of that more glittery, colorful, and glamorous type rap music that came along. Just didn't really go for it. And I started to get back into what I considered to be the next evolution of grunge and alternative music, which was the industrial stuff. Because then I got introduced to bands like Nine Inch Nails, Marilyn Manson, Tool, Skinny Puppy, Revolting Cocks, a bunch of these really weird, KMFDM, a lot of different bands that took maybe a little bit more of a hard, crunchy sound and added it with that whole industrial / electronic sound. That music, man, it just takes me away. I can still go back and listen to some of that stuff and feel the same kind of, not only just angst and even anger, but the release that the music kind of helped to facilitate in a guy like me. And I still have a lot of that music in my bedroom right now on top of a top of a dresser in cassette tape form. Maybe one of these days I'll make a cassette tape collection video to show off all of my old tapes, even though I haven't listened to any of them in ages. Anyway, shifting away from the music, because I kind of wanted to talk about a few other things, and maybe this will turn into a two-parter, I don't know. I didn't really want it to be, but it's a big decade. Movies. Mainly by virtue of the fact that I became an adult and got my own job and had my own money to spend and learned how to drive and was on my own, so it was my decision what I wanted to do with my time and my money. I started to go to the movies all the time. I mentioned that in the Going to the Movies video. But the 90s was like a birthplace for me and my love for cinema. I call it cinema, but I don't think I really mean it the way that most people would, because my movie tastes are all over the place. I love, lots of big, dumb action movies, the summer popcorn movies. Those are, awesome to me, just as much as any of the stuff that I might have that would be considered, a term I would use that a friend of mine called himself, he called himself a movie snob. There are those movies out there that the movie snobs would love, and I have a few of those in my collection, but I would say for the most part I really do just like big action movies, superhero movies, disaster movies, CG movies, sci-fi stuff, superheroes, if I didn't say that already. That's kind of where my tastes in movies tend to revolve, but I also like a lot of comedy stuff and animated stuff. But the 90s, the point of what I was saying was that the 90s were loaded with some of my favorite movies. Anything from the original Jurassic Park, but any of the Jurassic Park movies, to Forrest Gump, to I got to think about it here for a second that I don't say some movie that didn't come out in the 90s. Shawshank Redemption, I think that was a 90s movie. Gosh, I may have to actually look over towards my movies just to see if what I'm missing. Well, of course, the first X-Files movie was in the 90s. And I guess I'd be remiss if I didn't throw out there really quick that a lot of my favorite TV shows were in the 90s at some point. The X-Files, my favorite television show, was from the 90s. Star Trek Next Generation was about half of its lifetime was in the 90s. Well, I can't think of anything else right off the top of my head. Obviously, there was a lot of good old comedies back then. Home Improvement, even Family Guy started in the 90s, even though its best years were in the 2000s. Anyway, TV, awesome. The movies, awesome. I'll save more of the TV and movie talk for those videos because I plan on doing those. But I've given a lot of time to those other things, but I think my favorite thing from the 90s, the video games. Entered into the 90s, and it was Super Nintendo days and Sega Genesis. I had a Super Nintendo and a Genesis and loved a lot of stuff from that. But my favorite console, if we're talking about its library of games, would be the PlayStation, the original PlayStation. That was in the 90s. The N64 in the 90s. Some of my favorite games of all time all come out of the 90s. From like your Super Metroids to your Tomb Raiders, Metal Gear Solid, Silent Hill, the X-Files game for the PC that I had in the previous video. All that stuff came from the 90s. Gaming was on its last pure leg before we started dabbling in all this online crap in the 90s. You know, because you had like the PS2, which would have the capabilities of online stuff that debuted at the very end of the 90s. Your Dreamcast, first console that had a built-in 56K modem in it. So that stuff in the 90s was untainted by all of that kind of action. The N64, I guess, had some of it when you kind of consider the 64 DD, but I don't want to get too much into all of that. You know, my point is, I've used this term before. I've kind of dropped using it here lately. I don't know why, but I consider the 90s and that time around the N64 and the PlayStation, and you know, maybe right around the time the Dreamcast came along, and some of that late 90s PC stuff to be my golden era of gaming. PS2 is loaded with great stuff that I absolutely love and adore, and the PS3 and the 360 and even the Wii have not let me down with some of the fun stuff that they've offered. But the 90s, for gaming, for movies, for comic books, I'm just going to mention this briefly because I'll probably talk more about comics later, but the only time in my life I really ever got into comic books was in the mid to the late 90s. Collecting baseball cards started in the late 80s but stretched into the 90s. My collecting of really most anything that I have in my house of action figures. Nothing's nearby where I can show it off, but I have a few action figures. It's pretty much all stuff I got in the 90s. I collected Hot Wheels for a time in the 90s. I miss the 90s so much. I wish, you know, it's dumb and all that, but you know, people will ask those questions like, if you had a time machine, when would you go and would you do it? Where would I go? The 90s. Would I do it? Absolutely. I would go back to the 90s. I think sometimes there are moments in my life when I would be perfectly happy going back to the 90s and reliving the entire decade again, getting in that time machine and going back and doing it over and over again. The 90s were just a really important time for me. It was a time that I basically discovered all of my favorite passions and hobbies were all in the 90s. So The 2000s, just to mention really quickly, things were a little different in my life. I got married, like I said, I had kids. The responsibilities of being an adult came along. I haven't necessarily handled all those responsibilities the best, so maybe that's why it's a little bit of a damper on things. There were some good things. There were lots of great movies and video games and things of that nature, but the 90s is still the time I remember with the most happy thoughts and feelings. So yeah, anyway, that's all I wanted to say about that. The 90s, I miss them. Such a great decade, such amazing things going on in the world, and anybody who is old enough to have lived out the entire 90s, and if you're watching this video because of my gaming stuff, you probably know where I'm coming from on this. So anyway, thanks a lot for joining this video. I'm getting it wrapped up just about the right time. I'll see you guys next time. Thanks a lot.